morning. This is your host, Lance Gordon, The Philosophy of the Ananke, and we will continue where we were leaving off. We were still at the end of chapter 4, I believe. So let us continue in the reading. The origin of the universe. From scientific reality and our knowledge of the Ananke, we can paint a most probable picture of the origin and destiny of our universe. I present to you, the reader, my interpretation of the scientific/Ananke version of the creation. In the beginning, there was a primal plasmatic ball of mass, more dense than a dwarf star. This enormously dense original substance continued to compress itself by the forces of gravity, electromagnetism, and nuclear bonding. At some remote time in our past, perhaps 20 billion years ago, the density was so great that even the nuclei of all of the atoms could not move. As scientists have discovered, there is a critical density and mass where matter spontaneously explodes. Eventually, that critical point was reached. The primal, homogeneous ball of enormously dense matter exploded with a ferocity unknown to man. A great light occurred. This birth of our universe transpired in less than 24 hours. In essence, it was the event of the first day. Let me also say that it's been speculated that it's a singularity point and the explosion occurred, but it's hard to extrapolate back that far to any degree of certainty as to what really went on. But we do know it came from some sort of central location and has expanded ever since. Let's continue the story. The force of entropy, which is useless energy, chaotic energy, dominated for a while. Chaos ruled the day. As the energy expanded, particles were formed through a process of transformation. Gases emerged in time. These primal gases moved with great speed away from the common center of the Big Bang. They tended to separate in the firmament, producing clusters of gaseous mass separated by empty space. The cohesive forces began to work. Order was gaining control. The division of the firmament was complete. It was the second primary event. In essence, it was the second day. The gaseous clusters began to move. Entropy and random motion occurred, but the cohesiveness of gravity would not let the gases stray. They began to swirl. Galaxies were formed, and the cohesive forces were successful on the third day. In every part of each galaxy, a similar process was happening. Small gaseous formations were dividing in the firmament. They began to move. These systems of primal gas began to condense even further with the help of gravity. They cooled and condensed until the mass was so close that the probabilistic nuclear reactions could take place. The density in the center of the cluster was enormous. Hydrogen was being combined under pressure to form other elements. Fusion occurred. Stars were born. This event could be considered the fourth day. Gases swirled around the newly created stars. They localized and divided into smaller groupings of swirling particles. They condensed but had not the mass for the nuclear fusion to take place. The gases formed a primal plasma, a kind of liquid rock. The process continued. The cohesive forces were unrelenting. Probabilistic chemical reactions started happening. Atoms combined with atoms, molecules with molecules. Planets were born. Gravitational, electrical, and magnetic forces continued in their pursuits. The liquid plasma began to divide due to the nature of the atomic arrangements that were formed. Elements and compounds behaved differently depending on their unique shapes. As cooling progressed, some of the plasma became solid igneous rock. Some of the elements stayed as gas. Some became water. The waters under the heaven were gathered together, and dry land appeared, with an atmosphere surrounding all. This being the event of the fifth day. And by the laws of this Ananke all came to pass. Order and repetition guided the universe. Chaos was losing the battle. The primal earth was ready for the next stage in the process of control. When the conditions were right, life would form. The ultimate controlling force over matter would emerge out of necessity. And so the primal atmosphere released the necessary energy to the oceans below. A pool of amino acids emerged from the sea. The endothermic chemical reaction was complete. That's absorption of energy. The building blocks of life had formed. In time, all would evolve in a logical manner. Fish and fowl, insects and cattle, creatures of various forms emerged by a process of controlled evolutionary change and natural selection. Man was born, these being the events of the sixth day. Eventually, all the energy from the initial explosion will be controlled. It'll be converted into potential energy of various forms. The motion of the particles will stop in space and begin to reverse direction. All will move to their origin once more. All will move to the center. Potential energy will be converted into kinetic, mass into motion. All will move under the influence of the common force of gravity. The primal plasmatic ball will form again. The cycle will repeat itself in a state of perpetual motion. The universe cannot lose energy nor receive it. It is the perfect closed system. The cycle will continue forever. Of course, there are other speculations in the sciences that deal with the universe that is exploding now and expanding forever, but they don't know what the dark matter is. There's all sorts of debates out there as to what really is going on. I don't think in my opinion, there's a perfect consensus. So my speculation probably is as good as anybody else's. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that origin of the universe. The pattern is clear. The dynamic equilibrium of the spherical primordial mass was disturbed. It exploded. Forces emerged to control the chaos and bound its influence. The chaos will be controlled in an ultimate state of universal potential energy. All will stop like the ball on the spring, like a pendulum at its peak. Motion will reverse direction until dynamic equilibrium is reached again. The primordial ball will form once more. There is another option, and that is it could possibly, aside from going on forever as an option, it could reverse motion and seal itself in that singularity point, which we'll get into later in the book and updates. But anyway, this is my take back in 1985. The pattern will begin again. Dynamic equilibrium will be disturbed. Opposing forces will emerge to control the negative change. The forces will accomplish this task in a most efficient manner. All will tend toward dynamic equilibrium. All will seek balance in a state of relative calm. All will seek peace. This is the Ananke. Chapter 5. Ananke and Logical Speculation. Introduction. We have accomplished many things towards the understanding of this phenomenon called Ananke. We have discovered its origin in early Greek thought and its uniqueness as a decipherable set of patterns. It appears to be logical and with purpose. Its patterns seem to culminate in a formula that describes a universal picture of behavior. Scientific law, as well as human phenomenon, seem to be guided by this fourfold formula as well. Science can discover its law and utilize the results, but it cannot change Ananke. Until this chapter, we have not addressed the issue of a God behind the order Ananke. It was not necessary. All of our conclusions were based on the observable world data and pattern repetition. It would be viable to stop our discussion at this point and leave our conclusions at the following. 1. The universe is not composed of arbitrary forces and behavior patterns that are unrelated. 2. The universe seems to coordinate these cohesive forces and in common behaviors towards the ultimate purpose of equilibrium, balance, tranquility, and calmness for all things. The universe seems to have states of dynamic equilibrium that are constantly being disrupted. 4. Opposing cohesive forces seem to emerge with the expressed purpose of controlling the negative change, the disturbance, the injustice. 5. Eventually, given enough time, the forces of the universe contain the change and bring it back to equilibrium in a most efficient manner. 6. The time element of this universal cycle can vary from mere microseconds to billions of years. The time element depends on the size of the dynamic equilibrium system that is being disrupted. In other words, the Big Bang of our universe will be contained and coordinated in the order of billions of years, while a disrupted atom may achieve a new state of balance in a fraction of a second. 7. Change seems to be inevitable. There is even a statistical tendency for things to wander and scatter to the corners of space. Extreme order and condensation seem to be opposed. Extreme physical closeness seems to result in a spontaneous explosion, as in the nature or potential nature of the Big Bang. In summary, this primary cycle contains the properties of dynamic equilibrium, chaotic forms of energy, opposing cohesive forces, and a state of activity that is most efficient at achieving the ultimate purpose of peace, as reflected by the abundant equilibrium systems that coexist today. 9. We call this universal cycle, this universal repetitive pattern, this universal order, Ananke. But what does this Ananke say about man? If we stop our discussion, what can we conclude? Do the conclusions give us a satisfied feeling? Let us examine the results and see. 1. We seem to be bound by Ananke, but we are not determined by it. We can strain the law, but we can never break it. We can go against the flow and experience a lot of pain, or we can go with it and experience less pain. After all is said and done, some pain in life is inevitable. 2. The evidence suggests that the universe is tending toward equilibrium systems in this phase of its perpetual cycle. Therefore, there is a factual basis to believe that the flow is toward equilibrium and not away from it. We must conclude that going with the flow is merely seeking balance and peace for ourselves and others. Going with the flow would mean tending to be in balance with our environment. If destruction is necessary, as in the consumption of food or in the utilization of natural resources, then the least negative solution should be sought. This is still the flow. In the light of this concept, number 3 here, in the light of this concept, achieving happiness becomes the process of minimizing the pain in life and maximizing the feeling of pleasure. We can accomplish this goal by following the way, or the flow of this Ananke, and by interpreting its 4 primary patterns with respect to the events in our lives. Theoretically, if we interpret correctly the appropriate actions, then we will experience enduring positive feelings while minimizing the inevitable pain. Since we are mortal, this is the best we can possibly hope to achieve in this life. This is the highest level of happiness that we can obtain. Is the above concept satisfying? And do we feel content at stopping the analysis at this point? Don't we feel a void, an emptiness to this end result? Are we not left with some questions that remain unanswered? Is the purpose of peace enough? Doesn't it feel like we are caught in an endless cycle that seems to go nowhere? Isn't the concept of Ananke lacking something? Do we not want answers to the following questions? 1. Why should we seek peace other than to avoid pain? The purpose of peace is just not good enough. What is the ultimate meaning of our lives? 2. Why do we live? Why do we have to die? 3. Where do we go when we die? Why are we aware? Number 4. Why are we aware of and have a property called consciousness? Where does this property go when we die? Or is it just generated by the body and goes poof? 5. Do we have a soul that is separate from the body, our bodies? 6. If a soul exists, then what is it and where does it go upon death? 7. Does a supreme consciousness exist, an absolute mind behind this order? 8. If it does exist, then where is it? Why does it exist? How does it communicate with us? How can we communicate with it? 9. If God exists, then why is it putting us through this turmoil? Isn't it supposed to be omnipotent? Can't it make a perfect universe at its will if it is supposedly all-powerful? 10. What is the meaning, the answer to our lives? Unfortunately, we cannot answer these questions with the same scientific diligence that we utilized in the previous chapters, but we can take an educated best guess. We can utilize the patterns of Ananke and other tools in order to logically speculate on the nature of God, soul, purpose, and afterlife. I am happy to inform you that the logic delivers an appealing answer. Let us first investigate the meaning of speculative logic. Logical speculation. In this section, we will deal with the logic that will be employed in the following pages. Certain principles will be followed by the author. The established laws of logic will be maintained to a diligent degree. However, we will use some of the conclusions from the previous chapters. We will call these conclusions about Ananke the established principles. We will use these principles or theorems of Ananke along with basic logic in order to speculate the most likely scenario as the answer to the above questions. The theorems of Ananke are as follows. Theorem number 1. Ananke is consistent both in the physical and the spiritual world. This is the theorem of consistency. Scientific evidence suggests that the forces in the universe are consistent in both time and space. Stars are not square and triangular, they are round. Light bulbs worked in 1920 and in 1985 and now in 2017. The forces did not suddenly change. Consistency and logic guides the universe and not chance. Theorem number 2. The four patterns can be applied to explain the spiritual world as well as the interaction with the physical world. This is the theorem of the formula. Since Ananke is assumed to be consistent by the evidence, then the four patterns must apply to all events, both physical and spiritual. At least that's the speculation that we're doing, that we can be deductive in the spiritual like we were in the other realms, which were more tangible, like Ananke in man and Ananke in science. In other words, we will assume that all things tend towards dynamic equilibrium. However, disruption always occurs. The opposing forces tend to control this change in a most efficient, least negative manner. Eventually, a balance is achieved between the inevitable negative change and the cohesive forces of the universe. This pattern continuously repeats itself. Theorem number 3. Any phenomena or pattern that exists over numerous independent objects can be extended by induction to the remaining particles in the universe. This is the theorem of analogy. In other words, since Ananke was found to culminate in a single purpose, all objects must manifest the higher laws or patterns in some way. Conversely, in-common manifestations of a large group of objects may not be due to coincidence. These manifestations may be reflecting higher patterns of Ananke that can be utilized in order to speculate about the nature of different objects and events. Therefore, at appropriate times in our discussion, we will employ what's called analogy to the situation under investigation in order to gain potential insight. Theorem number 4. Any logical scenario that retains the property of purpose and wholeness of concept will be preferred to other alternatives. This is the theorem of unity. We have found that Ananke has purpose and is a oneness of coordinated activity and force. It is universal in time and space. Scientific evidence and our own experience seems to verify this conclusion. Therefore, it should be reasonable to conclude that if God, soul, and afterlife does exist, then it should conform to the properties of the Ananke that we have discovered thus far. The hypothetical scenario should deliver a thought and feeling of oneness and unity to the entire design. It should deliver a thought and feeling of purpose to the scheme of things. All other scenarios would necessarily contradict our previous findings and would therefore be less likely to be true. The truth is assumed to be consistent and universal over all particles and events in the cosmos. Contradictions necessarily point to faults in our reasoning. Spirit, soul, and consciousness. Do we have a property called consciousness, or awareness of oneself of form? I believe the answer is self-evident. But does this awareness suggest soul? Let us logically speculate the answer. By the theorem of the formula, we can conclude that every dynamic equilibrium system must have opposing forces that are in a dynamic state of balance. Our cells, little dynamic states of equilibrium, have numerous cohesive forces at work in order to maintain homeostasis of itself. Disruptions are quickly opposed, reasonable balance is maintained, or the cell dies. Similarly, the coordination of billions of cells, the body, is a larger system of dynamic equilibrium. The body tends to get disrupted. Imbalance is inevitable due to environmental changes. What is the opposing forces that coordinates the counterattack? It cannot be the brain, since the brain is part of the body. The body cannot oppose itself. It is not a pure opposite. Theoretically, the opposition to the body, which opposes the disruption of the body, and consequently the brain as well, must be of a form that is opposite to the nature of flesh. It must be non-body, non-flesh, non-matter. Let us call this opposing force to the body, quote, spirit or mind. So we have deduced that spirit must exist as defined above. It opposes the imbalances that occurs to our bodies. It signals the appropriate spot on the brain to take action. If a section of brain tissue is removed, it cannot work. It is the controller of the body and not the machinery. It has no memory, for this is the property of the brain. It only manipulates and digests information. It gives the resulting logical commands to the brain. This is analogous to a computer's central processing unit, which has no memory of its own, yet can utilize memory chips, floppy disks, and megabytes worth of auxiliary memory in order to do its bidding. Therefore, spirit is the controlling mind, which subconsciously and consciously opposes our bodily imbalances. But what is soul? Is it the conscious portion of spirit? Perhaps we can analyze it in this manner. When a bodily imbalance occurs, the subconscious mind quickly obtains the facts, processes the information, and signals the brain to counterattack. The procedure has evolved over millions of years. It needs no intervention, and there is no necessary choice. In essence, the subconscious mind strictly obeys Ananke. However, when alternatives exist that depend on facts in the environment, as they exist now, the conscious part of the mind takes over. Our conscious mind observes the real world, digests the perceived facts, and attempts to process the information with the help of the subconscious mind. Conclusions emerge from the depths of the subconscious mind, and we take action accordingly. Our conscious minds never work alone. On the contrary, our subconscious minds can and do. Therefore, although the conscious mind is similar to the subconscious mind, it is subservient to it. It is a subset to the property called mind. It is an extension to this thing called spirit. It mimics the subconscious spirit, but depends upon it. Based upon this subjective evidence, we can conclude that if soul exists, then there is a good possibility that it is merely the conscious portion of our mind. Thus, our soul is similar to our subconscious spirit, but dependent upon it. Our subspirit, as I would like to call it, is more powerful. The subspirit is more powerful than our soul, meaning the subconscious mind. Since it is more powerful, it should not be called sub. This word suggests that it is under our conscious minds. More appropriately, the subspirit, or subconscious mind, should be called the superconscious portion of our mind. It is superior to our conscious mind or soul. Moreover, our superspirit or superconscious mind seems to follow Ananke and is therefore non-whimsical in its behavior. If it is non-whimsical, it probably need not be reflective. It does not need to reflect and decide on a course of action. It merely has to think directed thoughts, which are associated with the outcomes that we attribute to Ananke. Thus, our superspirit can be defined as a superconscious, non-whimsical, non-reflective mind. It has the ability to generate pure, directed thought at locations within our brains. It can control the behavior of matter. Both superspirit and soul are not matter, nor are they the energy that is derived from matter. Both superspirit and soul are not memory. They manipulate memory, but do not possess it. Both superspirit and soul are the capacity to think. In essence, they are pure thought. The realization that we exist as a whole entity is a reflection of this pure thought. The feeling of I exist is independent of memory or time of day. This feeling is just as real in a dream as it is when we are awake. This feeling is just as real now as it was when we were 6 years old. It has not changed with time. Our bodies have changed, but the feeling of I exist has not. The cells of our body have died several times, and yet we have not. So the soul and most probably the superspirit are both separate from and in opposition to the body. They are pure and independent thought. In summary, the soul and superspirit are the opposing forces to the disruptions that may occur to the dynamic equilibrium called the body. They supply the coordinated thought that directs the brain to take action towards the goal of internal peace. They utilize the energy received from matter, food, in order to achieve this goal of balance within the body and between this dynamic oneness and the environment. The soul and superspirit utilize energy but are not energy. The soul and superspirit utilize memory but are not memory. They are both pure and independent thought. They reflect the feeling that I exist. They reflect the feeling of I am. The superspirit is more powerful than the soul. It is a superconscious, non-whimsical, non-reflective mind. The soul is an extension of, but separate from, the superspirit. The soul can influence and strain the superspirit, but it can never break it. The superspirit obeys Ananke. The soul may or may not. Does spirit, soul, and consciousness exist in other living creatures? Do dogs and cats have a conscious and superconscious mind as described above? Of course they do. Anyone who's ever had a pet anything can testify to the conscious thought process and unique personality that was Jeannie the cat or Bugs the rabbit or Basha the dog. Certainly this property of spirit and soul, of mind, of pure thought, would not be at the exclusion of these precious creatures. They need opposing forces to their bodies as well. They live in an environment where conscious choice must be made for their body's welfare. As an example, even monkeys have been shown to create tools. Some of these tools are used to remove termites from their nesting places as a source of food. Therefore, monkeys consciously think. If they consciously think, then they must have a soul as defined above. If they have a soul, then they probably have a superspirit as well. Where does the logic stop? Does everything have soul and superspirit? Not really. If the dynamic equilibrium system does not require the necessity of choice with its environment, then it does not need a soul. An atom may not need to consciously think. It only needs to react appropriately. Our cells may not need to consciously think. They only need to react to the signals generated by the brain. These objects do not need a conscious reflective thought process. They need no conscious mind. But they do require an opposite to the matter, which is in dynamic equilibrium. As deduced above, the equilibrium of matter must be maintained through thought of some mind. Perhaps a form of superconscious mind coordinates the atomic activities. It may generate the coordinated thought. This thought may in turn stimulate the matter in question to release the cohesive forces. In turn, the forces would direct the particles to take action towards the goal of its internal balance. This is similar to the subconscious mind stimulating its matter, the brain. The brain in turn releases the appropriate chemicals, which eventually oppose the imbalances of the body. In this manner, equilibrium is achieved once more. This superconscious mind of matter may utilize the energy of matter in order to achieve this goal of balance within its body and between this dynamic oneness and its environment. Atomic systems must exist in balance from within and between themselves according to the laws of the Ananke. They need the opposite called superspirit, the superconscious mind. This superconscious spirit utilizes energy, but is not energy. This superconscious spirit may store information in matter and retrieve it, but it's not memory. It is pure, non-whimsical, non-reflective, independent thought. It is similar to the feeling of I exist. It is reflected by the feeling of I am that I am. This superconscious spirit seems to obey the laws of Ananke. And at this point we'll stop. It's about a half an hour. And let me see where we are. We are 29 minutes. So we will return to chapter 5 the next time. This was part 11, and we are going through chapter 5 right now. See you next time.